The air in London on the morning of August 23, 1305, was thick with the usual city smells: coal smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the damp scent of the Thames. But today, another, sharper aroma was beginning to assert itself. It was the scent of anticipation, a metallic tang of bloodlust that hung over the city like a shroud. They were gathering for a spectacle, a festival of state-sanctioned savagery, a lesson written in flesh and bone. At the center of it all was one man, William Wallace, a name whispered with fear in English halls and with reverence in the Scottish Highlands. A name that was about to be unmade, piece by agonizing piece. Hollywood has given us a hero's death, a defiant cry for freedom before a swift end. But history is not a Hollywood script. It is a butcher's block. What truly happened that day at Smithfield was not a noble sacrifice, but a meticulous and cold-blooded act of annihilation, designed by a king who understood that true power lies not in killing your enemies, but in destroying the very idea of them. This is not the story of how a hero died. This is the story of how an empire tried and failed to kill a legend. To understand the methodical cruelty of Wallace's end, we must first understand the mind of the man who ordained it. King Edward I of England, known to his enemies as Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots. Edward was not a simple brute. He was an architect of power, a man who saw the island of Britain not as a collection of kingdoms, but as a single, unfinished tapestry of which he was the master weaver. In his mind, Scotland was a frayed edge, a rebellious thread that needed to be brutally snipped and woven back into the whole. He was a king of laws and ledgers, a man who believed in order above all else, and rebellion was the ultimate chaos. Imagine him in the cold stone chambers of Westminster, long fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed not on the man, Wallace, but on the map that represented his life's work. To his advisors, he would not have spoken of anger or revenge. His words would have been precise, clinical. "He is not a soldier," we can imagine him saying, his voice a low rasp. "Soldiers can be ransomed. Knights can be honored in their defeat. Wallace is a disease, an infection in the body politic of my kingdom. You do not reason with a plague. You do not imprison it. You burn it out. You make an example of it, so visceral, so absolute, that the very thought of contagion dies in the minds of lesser men for 100 years to come." His punishment for Wallace was born not of passion, but of cold, terrifying logic. It was a political calculation, an instrument of statecraft where the currency was human agony. And who was the man who had provoked such calculated fury? William Wallace was not a king, nor a great lord born to lead. He emerged from the mists of obscurity, a minor landowner from a Scotland gasping under Edward's heel. The English occupation was a slow strangulation, taxes, garrisons, humiliations large and small. For Wallace, the political became brutally personal. We don't know the exact details, but the chronicles whisper of family members lost to English aggression. Loss can break a man, or it can forge him into something harder than steel. Wallace was forged. When he stood at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he was not just a commander, he was the physical embodiment of Scottish rage. He saw what the great nobles, with their English lands and divided loyalties, refused to see, that the lumbering beast of the English army, with its heavy cavalry and arrogant knights, could be bled. The victory at Stirling was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological earthquake. It sent a tremor through the foundations of Edward's authority, proving that the dream of a free Scotland was not the fantasy of poets, but something that could be won with wood and iron and an unbreakable will. In that moment, Wallace ceased to be a man. He became a symbol. And Edward Longshanks knew that symbols were infinitely more dangerous than men. A man can be killed. A symbol, if not handled correctly, can become immortal.
The years that followed were a slow, grinding descent. Edward, the master strategist, did not just fight Wallace on the battlefield, he fought him in the minds of the Scottish nobility. He offered them a choice: annihilation at his hand or accommodation within his system. One by one, the great houses of Scotland, weary of war and fearful for their lands, chose survival. They bent the knee. Wallace's continued resistance became an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a ghost from a battle they no longer wished to fight, a living reminder of a defiance they had abandoned. The hunt for William Wallace became Edward's obsession. It was a shadow war fought in darkened alleyways and the back rooms of taverns. Spies and informants were the king's weapons. A substantial bounty was placed on William Wallace's head, turning allies into potential betrayers. The net, woven with threads of silver and fear, tightened around him. He was isolated, driven to the fringes, a king of a shrinking kingdom of outlaws and patriots. The end, when it came, in August 1305, was as sordid as it was inevitable. Betrayal came not from an English knight, but from a Scottish one, Sir John Menteith, a man who had once sworn fealty to the cause, made his own calculation of survival. We can almost picture the scene: a clandestine meeting, a bag of English silver changing hands, a map marking a safe house near Glasgow. Perhaps Menteith justified it to himself. This endless war bleeds Scotland dry. His death will bring peace. It is the greater good. But the clink of coins has a way of silencing the whispers of conscience. Wallace was taken in the night, not in the glory of battle, but in the quiet dark of treachery. The symbol of Scottish resistance was now English property. His journey south to London was the first act of the execution. It was a carefully choreographed procession of humiliation. Bound tightly in chains, he was paraded through the towns and villages of northern England. This was not a transfer of a prisoner, it was the unveiling of a trophy. Crowds gathered to gawk and jeer at the Scottish ogre, the monster from their bedtime stories. For weeks he endured this degradation. What were his thoughts during those long, rattling miles? Was it the cold burn of betrayal? Was it the faces of the men who died for him? Or was it a retreat into some inner fortress, a place where the jeers of the crowd and the bite of his chains could no longer reach him? We can only imagine him, silent, his gaze fixed on a horizon only he could see, his spirit detaching itself from the broken vessel of his body. He was being transformed from a man into an object of scorn long before the executioner's knives were even sharpened. His arrival in London was met with a city primed for a festival. The trial, held at Westminster Hall on August 23rd, was the legal prelude to the physical dismemberment. It was a masterpiece of propaganda. The Great Hall, a symbol of English justice, was the stage. The charges were read in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not comprehend, its cadence a meaningless drone designed to overwhelm and confuse. Treason, murder, sacrilege, each word was a stone cast upon him. The irony was suffocating. He was accused of treason to a king whose authority he had never once acknowledged. When finally given a chance to speak, through a translator, his voice, perhaps hoarse from disuse, cut through the legalistic charade. According to the chronicles, he admitted to the charges of war, of killing Englishmen, of burning their towns, but on the charge of treason, he was unyielding. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. In that moment, in the face of certain death, he asserted his truth. He was not a rebellious subject. He was a captured enemy in a war between two nations. This single act of defiance, this refusal to accept their legal framework, was his final battle. It sealed his fate, though that fate had been written in stone the moment he was captured. The judges, puppets of the king, delivered the preordained sentence. It was not simply death. It was a detailed recipe for the complete deconstruction of a human being. To be drawn, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each step was steeped in gruesome symbolism, a public exorcism of the demon of rebellion. The morning sun rose over Smithfield, a wide open space that served as London's livestock market and its theater of death. The air, usually thick with the smell of animals, now buzzed with the energy of thousands of spectators. This was not a somber affair. Vendors sold meat pies and ale, men gambled, children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. The scaffold was the center stage, a stark wooden structure against the morning sky. The execution had been turned into a public holiday, a civic ritual where the people became participants in the king's power. The procession began. Wallace was stripped to a loincloth,
his body already bruised and bloodied from the journey. He was not allowed the dignity of walking to his own death. He was tied by his feet to a hurdle, a simple wooden frame, and dragged behind horses from the Tower of London. The journey was 4 miles long, 4 miles of cobblestones and filth. Imagine the sound, the scraping of the wood, the dull rhythmic thud of his head against the stones, the roar of the crowd, a wave of hate that washed over him. He was being plowed into the very earth of the city that condemned him, his blood marking the root of his final humiliation. He was no longer a man. He was refuse being dragged to the midden heap. Eyewitness accounts, even those hostile to him, noted his unnerving silence. He did not scream. He did not beg. He endured. At Smithfield, he was untied and dragged onto the scaffold. The carnival atmosphere reached a peak pitch. The executioner, a man whose profession was the art of inflicting pain, stepped forward. He was not a monster, but a craftsman, a functionary of the state. The first step was the hanging. The noose was placed around his neck, but it was positioned not to break it, not to grant a quick death. It was meant to strangle, to suffocate, to bring him to the very brink of oblivion. The crowd watched as his body convulsed, his face turning a deep, horrifying purple. The world for William Wallace would have compressed into a single desperate need: air. The light would have faded, the roar of the crowd becoming a distant hum. But just as the mercy of unconsciousness was about to claim him, he was cut down. He fell to the scaffold, gasping, choking, his lungs burning as they drew air once more. He was alive. He was conscious, and the real horror was only just beginning. While he lay there, pinned down, still aware, the executioner produced a long, sharp knife. What followed is almost beyond the limits of human comprehension. The blade sliced into his abdomen. Wallace was disemboweled while still living. The executioner, with practiced efficiency, reached into the cavity and began to pull out his internal organs, one by one. The chronicles state his screams were unlike anything ever heard, a sound that did not seem to come from a human throat, but from the very soul of agony itself. Each organ, his stomach, his liver, his heart, was held aloft for the cheering crowd to see, a gory trophy, before being cast into a waiting fire. In medieval belief, the bowels were the seat of compassion. By burning his entrails before his living eyes, they were symbolically destroying his very humanity, reducing him to mere flesh and sinew. The smell of burning viscera joined the stench of the crowd, a hellish perfume for a hellish ritual. Throughout this unspeakable torment, his eyes remained open. What did they see? The leering faces in the crowd? The impassive sky? Or did his mind, in a final act of rebellion, conjure the green hills of Scotland, the one thing they could not touch, could not burn, could not destroy? Finally, as his life drained away in a torrent of blood and pain, came the final axe. The executioner took up a heavy axe. With a single expert stroke, he severed Wallace's head from his body. The suffering was over, but the desecration was not. The head was held up, a grotesque puppet for the roaring crowd, before being sent to be dipped in tar for preservation. His body, the vessel of his immense spirit, was then hacked into 4 pieces. Each limb, each quarter of his torso, was presented to the audience like a cut of meat at the market. Edward's message was not finished. It needed to be delivered across the kingdom. Wallace's tarred head was impaled on a pike on London Bridge, a silent, horrifying sentinel greeting all who entered the city. It was a warning. This is the fate of traitors. The 4 quarters of his body were dispatched to the corners of his rebellion. One piece to Newcastle, another to Berwick, a third to Stirling, the site of his greatest victory, a deliberate and final insult, and the 4th to Perth. Each piece of the man who had tried to unite Scotland was used to terrorize it, a bloody and tangible reminder of the long reach and merciless memory of the English crown. In the immediate aftermath, a stunned silence fell over Scotland. Edward's gambit seemed to have worked. The sheer, calculated barbarity of the execution was paralyzing. It was a spectacle so horrific it seemed to extinguish the very flame of resistance. Many Scottish nobles renewed their oaths to Edward, convinced that no cause was worth such an end. The symbol of resistance had been successfully transformed into a monument of terror. But Edward Longshanks, the master of war and law, had made a profound psychological miscalculation. He understood power, but he did not understand martyrdom. By seeking to annihilate Wallace's body, he had immortalized his spirit. The horror of the execution did not, in the long run, breed submission. It bred a harder, more desperate form of hatred. The story of Wallace's end, whispered in taverns and sung by bards, became a rallying cry. It showed the true face of English rule, not of law and order, but of savage butchery. It is said that Robert the Bruce, the nobleman who would eventually become King of Scots, was galvanized by the news of Wallace's fate. In Wallace's dismembered body, he saw the future of Scotland if it remained broken and subservient. The execution created a terrible clarity. There could be no compromise. Surrender meant not just chains, but the executioner's fire. Wallace's death taught the Scots that if they were to fight, they must fight to the very end, for capture was a fate worse than any battlefield death. The legacy of that bloody day in Smithfield echoes down through the centuries. Wallace, the failed rebel, became more powerful in death than he ever was in life. He became the eternal martyr, the embodiment of the Scottish struggle for freedom. The brutality of his end did not serve as a deterrent. It became the foundational myth of a nation. As we stand here, in the comfort of our modern age, it is easy to dismiss such events as the barbarism of a bygone era. But the story of William Wallace's execution forces us to confront timeless and uncomfortable questions. It reveals the terrifying capacity for cruelty that lies dormant within organized society, waiting only for the sanction of authority to be unleashed. The crowd at Smithfield were not monsters. They were ordinary people enjoying a day out, conditioned to see the systematic destruction of a man as entertainment and as justice. Edward's act was a testament to the belief that history is written by the powerful, that by controlling the narrative of a man's death, you can control his meaning. But he failed. His attempt to make Wallace an emblem of terror instead forged him into an eternal symbol of defiance. He proved that you can dismember a man, but you cannot kill an idea. The blood that soaked the cobblestones of London that day did not wash away. It seeped into the very soul of a nation, a permanent stain, reminding all who came after of the terrible price of freedom. And so we are left with a final chilling question. In the great struggle between power and principle, what is the true nature of victory? Is it the king on his throne, surrounded by the trappings of his authority? Or is it the dismembered man, whose spirit rises from the flames of his own immolation to inspire generations yet unborn? The story of William Wallace is a brutal reminder that history is not just a record of dates and events. It is a story of human endurance, of the fight for dignity in the face of absolute degradation. To truly understand our present, we must be willing to stare, unflinching, into the darkest moments of our past. If you believe these stories must be told, subscribe and join us in the archives as we continue to unearth the truths that lie buried in history's shadow. Let us know in the comments below.
When an empire tries to erase a symbol, does it not, in the end, make it eternal?